I thank you all for coming out today. My name is Mike Koparski. I'm the Associate Director for the Wheeler Institute for Water Law and Policy at the UC Berkeley School of Law. I'm one of the organizers of the symposium, along with Richard Roos-Collins, Peter Vorster, and Michael Hanneman. Before I introduce Dean Gillis to give some opening remarks, I want to just start with a small point of process. As you know, everybody who will take the stage today, with the exception, of course, of me, has a biography that's distinguished and voluminous. In the interest of brevity, I and the moderators have agreed to keep our introductions very short, but I commend you to the insert in your program and also to our website, which you can see posted here, for more information on the impressive list of speakers we've assembled today. Keith Gillis is Dean of the College of Natural Resources and a professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management, as well as a professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at UC Berkeley. And in his spare time, Dean Gillis chairs the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. Dean Gillis had the vision, along with Dean Sujit Chowdhury of the Berkeley School of Law, to step in as the earliest and foundational sponsor of this symposium. And for that, we all thank him. Dean Gillis?
Good morning. On behalf of both myself and Dean Sujit Chowdhury of the UC Berkeley School of Law, welcome to Mono Lake at 20, past, present, and future. I've been excited about this conference ever since Michael Hanneman cornered me on the sidewalk outside Giannini Hall and said, "Keith, I've been meaning to talk with you about an idea I've had." And it was a good idea, like most of Michael's. He's never given me a bum steer on anything that excited him. Mono Lake, of course, has really captured the imagination of a generation of Californians, and with good reason. It's an essential and uniquely Californian ecosystem, and it's stunningly aesthetic. But the significance of Mono Lake runs a lot deeper than its ecological uniqueness or its aesthetics. Today we're celebrating the Mono Lake cases, including the National Audubon and the Cal Trout decisions, and of course the subsequent State Board decision 1631. Together, these have collectively given us the basis for incorporating the public trust doctrine into California water rights decisions. The architect of the public trust doctrine, Joe Sachs, a longtime Berkeley faculty member, sadly passed away earlier this year. He was justifiably memorialized at the Berkeley Law School last semester as a brilliant scholar, as an inspiring public intellectual, and as a beloved colleague. We all mourn his passing, but celebrate his many accomplishments. Many others who turned the public trust doctrine into a reality in California are here with us today. The overarching question that all of the speakers that will be addressing you today are focused on is how can the opportunity afforded by the public trust doctrine to manage California's water resources in a broad and integrative manner be realized, given the political, social, economic constraints that we face. Today is for looking forward and backward. What are the actual results of the implementation of Decision 1631? What needs to be improved? What seems to be the best way to protect public uses of the Delta and Central Valley, consistent with maintaining reliable water supplies? Two Berkeley institutions that I'm quite proud of, along with their collaborators, convened today's program to promote a conversation on these topics. The Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at Berkeley educates the next generation of environmental leaders, develops policy solutions to pressing environmental and energy issues, and the Center's current initiatives focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, advancing the transition to renewable energy, and ensuring clean water for California's future. All issues that certainly are central to my own agenda on the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. The other Berkeley institution putting on today's conference, the Wheeler Institute for Water, Law, and Policy, is a program under CLE. It develops interdisciplinary solutions to ensure clean water for California. Recently established, just in 2012, the Institute conducts projects at the intersection of law, policy, and science. That sweet spot that Berkeley likes to operate in. This symposium illustrates the deeply interdisciplinary approach that we at Berkeley, along with our many fellow travelers and collaborators, try to bring to natural resource challenges. The organizers, and I think everyone in this room, recognizes that the legal issues at the center of this discussion can't be separated from the physical, economic, or ecological context in which they play out. While this is a UC Berkeley event, I don't think it's any accident that it's being held in Sacramento at the headquarters of the State Board itself. At UC Berkeley, we strive to lead not only in scholarship on the key issues of the day, but we're aware of our responsibility to produce work that's relevant and impactful. To do less would be to ignore our land-grant tradition and mission. Equally importantly, we try and put in the extra mile to engage with and contribute to the essential work that decision makers conduct on all our behalf. The organizers today have assembled a remarkable group of speakers, most of whom, all of whom, are more eloquent than me. They're in just the right location to dig into these critical issues at the right point in time. I hope you enjoy what promises to be a stimulating discussion. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, Dean Gillis. Before diving into the rest of our program, I'd like to mention that as Mono Lake and the topics under discussion today move into the 21st century, so should we all. Our audience today is fantastic, and I'll mention more about that a little bit later. As a first start in our 21st century symposium model, the symposium today is being webcast. I'd like to ask your help, however, in extending our audience even further. If anyone says anything interesting today, I invite you to fire up your Twitter accounts and tweet using the hashtag MonoLake20. Let's see if we can broaden the conversation even more. If you'd like to follow us and retweet some of our tweets, Berkeley Law CLE, it's an easy way to bring more attention and draw more people in to see if we can get more people watching the webcast this afternoon. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce Felicia Marcus. Felicia Marcus is chair of the State Water Resources Control Board, and as such, she holds a central responsibility for seeing that the implications of the Mono Basin cases are actualized in water rights decisions. Thus, it's fitting that she will be our first speaker of the day. Felicia? Oh my. Let's see. If you'll bear with me, we'll send someone to see if they can't rope Felicia into the room. And I note that we are actually running just a few minutes early, so clearly this is not her fault. Chair Marcus is in the building and will be approaching the podium momentarily. Thank you for your patience. Felicia, I apologize for introducing you a few minutes early. Thank you for showing up right on time.
Great. That's a clever way to be able to introduce somebody. What did he say? Oh, good. Terrific. Hi. Hi. Good to see so many of you. I am very much honored to be here and looking forward to the day. Although I do, and I suspect a couple of other folks who'd like to be here all day have to step out for the semi-annual Delta Implementation Committee meeting for a while. So I'm hoping someone's taping the proceedings. Yay. Because I want to listen to what I miss because of the importance of what you all are going to be talking about today. As a relative newcomer, not to the water world, but to the public trust discussion world, and certainly not to the Mono Lake world, but to the world of those of you who know it from a more Northern California or Eastern Sierra angle rather than the LA side of things, I'm really humbled by the assembled expertise and experience that's going to be in this room now and later on through the course of the day. So I thought I'd open the day quickly with just a few thoughts that reviewing the precipitating Audubon decision and many of your law review articles brought to mind as food for thought, and then close with some thoughts on D1641, or D1631. First, the Mono Lake decision, the Audubon decision, is a thing of beauty. Seriously, hopefully you probably reread it every day, but if you reread it, it is beautifully written. It's not flowery, but it's clear, intelligible, and thoughtful. And yet, to hear people talk about it, to hear them invoke it, has a Rashomon-like quality to it. I've heard it praised as a reason to set public trust flows of enormous magnitude, and I've heard it cited as justifying the importance of flows for urban sustenance and economic growth, as well as other economic growth. I've also heard it as justification for going beyond natural resource or transportation or commercial commerce needs, and that's just in the last month. Second, it strikes me that the simplicity and the sophistication of the decision is precisely what we need at this stage in our evolution of our water world, even with the expert protagonists. We're at a time where we have to get beyond the contest of the soundbite and evolve to a level of dialogue that befits the complexity of the times that we're in. As some of you have heard me say a lot in these past 2 years, it's rather astounding to me that the public discourse on key issues in California water consists of arguments at the extremes, sometimes just repeated louder and slower over the hearing process, or even over the decades in some cases. That's really something we can ill afford given the gravity of the challenges that face us now, let alone in the decades to come, that we can actually see fairly clearly from here. We've got climate change with the attendant loss of snowpack, our largest single storage source coming at us. We've inevitably got population growth, with one of only 5 Mediterranean agricultural areas in the world at our core. The issue of food security, or at least the production of healthy fruits and vegetables and nuts and fiber for the state, the nation, and the world is significant. And with the greatest biodiversity in the world, along with the greatest pace of threatening and endangering that biodiversity, we have a huge challenge before us. And yet, sadly, and much of it, I'll say the lion's share, although not all of it, but the lion's share of the dialogue on these issues tends to be all one-sided. It's all about the importance of one set of the competing interests, and often, though thankfully not always, it's about the denigration of the legitimate interest of a competing water user. Hence, the completely unhelpful polarization in the media of ag versus urban, or north versus south, or ag versus environment, or fish versus farmers, or fishermen and women versus farmers, etc. Those are true conflicts over a precious resource, to be sure, but they oversimplify the task at hand. Call me a Pollyanna, but I believe that fish and birds are important, that agriculture is important, that fishing is important, that urban economic stability and quality of life is important, and more. It's an odd way to argue in the public policy debate, but many do. Fortunately, I don't think a lawyer would do it to a judge, but I could be wrong. I also think these decisions are then very hard to do. I believe we need to exercise our public trust responsibilities far more than we have. Pre-Audubon, apparently our predecessors didn't believe we had the authority. Since then, we know we do, but other than the Mono Lake decision itself, we haven't been able to do that much. We've done some things, but we haven't done that much. I suspect occasionally it's been politics or fear, but more often a total lack of capacity, being underfunded and understaffed, which has recently been rectified the tiniest bit, but a significant bit. That said, we need to be thoughtful and we need to be fair. We need to exercise our authority, but we need to do it conscious of the reality of the situation we find ourselves in. It doesn't mean a decision to give all to public trust uses or none to public trust uses. It also doesn't mean splitting everything in thirds or fourths or whatever the number of parties are. So this gets back to the challenge of the tone of the arguments. There's no question that there's a lot at stake for fishermen and women. There's also no question there's a lot genuinely at stake for agriculture and urban users of water. There's no question that too much water was historically diverted away from where it would naturally go, which in combination with massive landscape changes wreaked devastation upon natural populations of species. It's also equally clear that the steps that have been taken to rectify that, whether through public trust, waste and unreasonable use, Port of Cologne, or Clean Water Act, have had and will have a very real impact upon agricultural and urban users who had developed farms and cities based on the historic use of that water. To them, making good on our public trust and environmental law responsibilities has indeed been a takeaway, and we need to recognize that as we talk about what we're doing. But it's not impossible to adapt, as the City of LA's response to the Mono Lake decisions has shown. In fact, the Mono Lake suite of decisions has spurred the City of LA to become one of the nation's leaders in efficiency, recycling, and stormwater capture programs, and certainly their plans. So the optimum dialogue is about degree and about how. It's about timing. And perhaps most important, it's about how to do things creatively to respect and use water as the precious resource that it is, coupled with the other things that we can do, whether it's using it more efficiently and ingeniously to grow crops, using it more efficiently and thoughtfully in the urban setting, or finding ways to help fish and wildlife in all the things they need in addition to or in concert with water to thrive, like removing barriers, creating habitat, water quality, etc. Decision 1631 was a critical step for the lake, for the City of LA, and for the State Water Resources Control Board. I was at the city during much of the effort, albeit not at DWP, but in Public Works. I was so impressed with the Mono Lake Committee and how they approached the totality of the issue, not just arguing for water to go to the lake, but working hard to try and find other resources for the city, pushing the city to see what it could do with efficiency, recycling, and the like. Martha Davis was my hero then and still is today. It seemed that she was spending more time on that side of things than on even arguing for the lake, and it was actually extraordinary as she helped us move forward on conservation, efficiency, and recycling at a critical time. I also saw folks at DWP who stepped up to the plate, as my own staff did the same, to try to help compensate for what would be a reduction in water supply. This effort actually brought out the best in many, many people across the city, many people that many of you have never gotten to see, folks who labor full-time as career bureaucrats in city offices whose lives were changed permanently for the better because of this work. Definitely was a better angels moment from the aspect that I was a witness to, and it was definitely behind the scenes. There are actually thousands of people in LA and government and outside of government for whom these efforts, the efforts that came out of this fight, this challenge, are the things that define the city today and which they're most proud of and inspired by, even though I know the relationship between DWP and Mono continues to be, well, complex. The challenge for us today is to take our next steps in accordance with the times in which the conflicts seem even sharper as more and more species and water bodies are threatened or diminished, and our population is bigger and climate change looms large. These are also times, though, in which we've seen more and more people reaching across historic silos and aisles to come up with multiple benefit solutions, to remove barriers, to reach accords of various kinds. Let's grow that space. by moving forward in an inclusive dialogue that goes beyond the is so, is not, you're a jerk, no I'm not level of discourse that we are all capable of at times, to a dialogue we are increasingly capable of that embraces, respects, and recognizes the complexity of the competing interests that are involved, and then call on our collective creativity to move forward. We know from the Mono Lake decisions and from the collective effort since then, as well as other shining examples, that it can be done, but that it takes a lot of work on the part of many people to make myriad tiny decisions every day to make something happen, in addition to big vision or a single court or a single board decision. Let's use the day to inform ourselves, to reacquaint ourselves with the decisions, the people, and the progress. Let's also use it to inspire us, to incorporate the efforts, the lessons, for better or for worse if appropriate, and to move forward and do some good with each other in the months and the years to come. Thank you to the organizers for pulling this amazing program together. Enjoy the day.
Thank you, Felicia, for your always thoughtful comments. It would be hard to put together a lineup as stacked as the one that we have for you today without having at least a few last-minute changes to the program. As Hap Dunning and a surprise speaker to follow this first session will make clear, Session 1 should actually be entitled A Retrospective on the Mono Basin Cases and Their Meaning. I gratefully acknowledge Mnott, Phelps, and Phillips, who's generously sponsored this panel. Len Weiss is here from the firm today. This session is one that has seen some 11th hour shuffling. And again, with such high caliber speakers, a few urgent conflicts are bound to arise, as they did for both Tom Birmingham and Scott Stein, who are not able to join us today. While their unique perspectives will be greatly missed on the panel, we are fortunate to have found some terrific stand-ins who were gracious enough to step in on short notice. Your new moderator, Professor Michael Hanneman, will introduce the panel with its new composition. Michael Hanneman is Professor of Economics at Arizona State University and Chancellor's Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. He was co-principal investigator for the economic analysis in the Mono Basin EIR conducted by Jones and Stokes for the State Water Board. We are delighted to introduce Michael and the rest of our first panelists. I will note we also have a special surprise guest immediately following this panel, which will end at 10:20. And I trust his remarks will be a great treat for all of us. Thank you.
So we're very grateful to Mark Del Piero, who was going to be the moderator, who will become a speaker, and to David Cobb, who will be the third speaker. The first speaker in this panel is Hap Dunning. Hap is Emeritus Professor of Law at UC Davis. In 1980, he convened a symposium to explore the application of the public trust doctrine. The proceedings of that symposium received widespread attention and were referred to significantly in the California Supreme Court decision in 1983. So, Hap.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. It's nice to see everybody here. I see lots of familiar faces, and I will try to stick to my time. Law professors sometimes have a hard time doing that, but Michael, if I go over, jump up and scream and try to get my attention. The title, which I don't think is in the program that I was given was about how the Mono Lake cases were a turning point in California water law. And that's what I've prepared to talk about. Now, the first point, the most obvious point, one everybody knows, is for the first time, the public trust doctrine was applied to the exercise. Not applied, it was in 1983, the court said it could be applied to the exercise of appropriative water rights. That was a very famous National Audubon decision, one that's one of the most discussed natural resources decision in the last century. Now, the public trust doctrine, I have to disagree just a little bit with Dean Gillis, who referred to Joe Sachs as the architect of the public trust doctrine. Joe Sachs was a marvelous public trust scholar. His article in the Michigan Law Review in 1970 kicked off a great deal of discussion in the academic world and other places, but the public trust doctrine goes way back before Joe Sachs. Many scholars trace it to Roman law, the Institutes of Justinian, the Holy Roman Empire. Others find traces of it in English law. In fact, at that conference it was mentioned, Joe Sachs gave a paper which talked about that. I personally tend to start with the U.S. development of the public trust doctrine, which I trace back to a decision in the 1820s in New Jersey that had to do with oyster beds and access to oyster beds in Raritan Bay. Now, the public trust doctrine is generally thought of as common law, that is, judge-made law. But in my opinion, and this is an opinion that is not shared by many other public trust scholars, it really does derive from federal law. The federal law developed the concept of state sovereign ownership that led to state ownership upon admission to the Union of the beds of navigable waters. More commonly, that doctrine is known as the equal footing doctrine. And to me, an interesting thing is the United States Supreme Court repeatedly has said that the equal footing doctrine is constitutional, even though you will not find the phrase equal footing in the federal Constitution. Apparently, it derives from the sense of union, the sense that every state has to be on an equal footing with regard to sovereignty. The eastern states, the colonies, had state sovereign ownership with regard to the beds of navigable waters. In those days, just the saltwater beds and the saltwater waters. But the federal courts have said it's constitutional. With regard to the public trust doctrine, which has been developed primarily at the state level, there are states who've said it's constitutional, even though the phrase does not appear in their constitution. Hawaii, in the Waiahole Ditch litigation, said that. Interesting to me, 5 years ago in California, the legislature enacted the Delta Reform Act, and they said in one provision of the Delta Reform Act that, quote, the longstanding constitutional principles of reasonable use and the public trust doctrine shall be the foundation of state water management policy. So here, I don't know, how the legislature can make something constitutional without going through an amendment process, but they did say that in the Delta Reform Act. So in California, I said that nationally, you can go back to Arnold and Mundy in the 1820s in New Jersey, but in California, you can find public trust cases back in the 1850s, very, very early. And the core idea was to protect public rights to navigable waters. Typically, the cases were about tidelands. So we're talking about the salt water washing over the tidelands, although there have been a couple of lakeshore cases, one with Clear Lake, one with Lake Tahoe. Now, by and large, the courts have insisted on this link to navigability, although there's one caveat possibly there. There's a very old decision that had to do with the dumping of sawdust into the Truckee River, and the court there said they would protect against that action in order to protect fish, whether they were in navigable water or not. Now I think under current boating tests and so forth, people would assume the Truckee River is navigable, but they didn't necessarily think that at the end of the 1800s. Now, that case can really be read as a nuisance case, not a public trust doctrine case, but if you want to read it as a public trust doctrine case, you've got one example there where public trust was used with regard to non-navigable water. Now, we also have another little little interesting comment. After Audubon, there were some public trust cases. They didn't get the same attention as Audubon because there were no appellate opinions. It was one on the American River. Judge Hodge and the Alameda Superior Court decided that, and there's one on Puda Creek, which is a small stream that comes out of the Coast Range. Judge Park in Sacramento decided that. Neither of them, well, the Puda Creek case was appealed, but there was a settlement. So we don't have any appellate opinion, but if you look at the transcript of the decision by the trial court judge, Richard Park, he said he thought the navigability requirement was, quote, archaic, if not arcane, and he said nothing whatsoever to do with proper allocation of water should involve thinking about navigability. He said flatly, navigability is not required. Very revolutionary idea in terms of the historic public trust doctrine, not an idea that the Supreme Court has embraced. There's a footnote in National Audubon where they say we don't have to address the question whether it applies in non-navigable situations, because although the creeks in the Mono Basin are non-navigable, or at least they were assumed to be non-navigable, they flow into a lake which had been determined to be navigable long before. So they said, well, the impact's on the lake, and that's the navigable body that we're protecting. Now, for those of you not familiar with the case, I'm sure Mark will go into this in much more detail, but basically what happened is after the State Water Board in 1940 granted appropriative water rights to the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power with regard to 4 freshwater creeks flowing into a saltwater lake, a very saltwater lake, very saline, more saline than the ocean, a number of things happened. There was really massive impact over the years. The lake level dropped, obviously, because the tributary water going in wasn't there anymore for most of the 5 creeks up there. And that was deemed a threat to the invertebrate life within the lake. There are a number of invertebrates that live in the lake that are a food source for birds. It's National Audubon Society, who's the plaintiff. Remember, they care about birds, and that's how the birds were impacted, the possibility that the vertebrate life would go. There's no fish life, but if the lake got too saline, the worry was the invertebrates would go, and that would be harmful for the birds. So that was one thing. There was the land bridge issue, because as the lake level dropped, areas that had been islands were turned into peninsulas, and there was nesting going on in those areas, and you had predator access, coyotes and so forth coming across. And then there was an air quality issue with the lake dropping. You had land exposed, what lawyers refer to as relicted land, and the wind can blow pretty hard in the Mono Basin and could blow around the particulates and cause concerns about air pollution, public health, and so forth. So that's one point. That's one turning point, that the public trust doctrine for the very first time was applied, or they said there's a potential to apply it to the exercise of appropriative water rights. There's a second point, a second turning point, which is a little more obscure and not so well known, and that is that the Supreme Court in 1983 changed public trust law with regard to water rights. It's not the same public trust law that had been applied to tidelands and lake shores. The theory in the tidelands and the lakeshore cases had been that, yes, there could be disposition of these state properties into private hands. Think about San Francisco Bay. Think about all the fill that's taken place on privately acquired lands. They said, but there is a public trust easement which continues to burden the fee ownership of the private owner. Now, I'm not sure how often that really made a difference, but the theory, at least, up until Audubon, and still is in the tidelands cases, is there is this public trust easement. Now, think about water. What would be the equivalent to a conveyance of land by the state to a private person? Well, the water code in California, as does the water code or the Constitution in most of the western states, says that the people own the water. Sometimes it says the state. California says the people own the water. But given the fact that people own the water, it's very clear that private use rights may be granted by the state. The technical term for this is usufructuary, one of the really nice phrases I used to love in teaching water law, to sort of get the students to learn how to say usufructuary. Really sounds wonderful. But if you followed the tidelands cases, you'd have to say every time the state granted an appropriative water right, that water right was burdened by the public trust. Supreme Court in 1983 was at great pains to say that is not the case. And they put it on practical grounds. They said, quote, the prosperity and, quote, the habitability in California requires diversions of massive amounts of water unrelated to public trust values. Quote, the state must have the power to grant non-vested usufructuary rights to appropriate water, even if diversions harm public trust uses. So they made it very clear. This is a different public trust law which is being applied to water, not the same one that was applied to tidelands. But they went on to say that in some situations where it's possible, maybe not with Owens Lake, but with Mono Lake, the impact of the public trust uses on the public trust uses of granting those water rights should be considered by the state. And this must be done, and this is one of the crucial passages in the decision, this must be done so far as feasible. So this feasibility idea, which is not found in the tidelands cases, is present in National Audubon. I think Felicia touched on the fact that back in 1940, when the Water Board granted the rights, they felt constrained under what they regarded as contemporary California water law, which did not include the public trust. They felt constrained by the use preferences, which are stated in the Water Code or in predecessor legislation, to grant the water rights. They said it may be unfortunate, and there was some fear that Mono Lake would end up like Owens Lake, a dry bed, but they said it's unfortunate, there's nothing we can do about it, our hands are tied, and as Felicia pointed out, now they know at the State Board that their hands are not tied. So another phrase I want to mention to you that comes out of the decision in 1983 is accommodation. It is inelegant. It's a beautiful decision, as Felicia mentioned. I agree with that thoroughly. Judge Broussard did a wonderful job on it. But what he said is we have two great systems historically. We have the water rights system, appropriative water rights, of course, are only one part of that, but we have a whole elaborate water rights system that's been developed since the mining days back in the 1850s. And then we have the public trust, which has been separate. And he said they may be on a collision course, but he said we think in some situations they can be accommodated. That was the key verb used. We have to accommodate public trust values and the values of appropriative rights. Neither one is superior to the other. As some enviros may think, it's not a case of a court saying, well, public trust wins always. That's not it. You have to accommodate. Now, so that's two turning points. Number one, using public trust for appropriative water rights, potentially. Number two, changing the public trust law to suit what the court thought was appropriate in the water rights context. The third thing was to use the public trust for broad protection of the environment. Now, historically, when courts wrote about the public trust, they always cited three interests: navigation, commerce, and fishing. Okay, now, are those environmental? Well, fishing. What about that? Many people would regard the things that came under the heading of fishing as sort of environmental. There are decisions that say, well, there's the fishing itself, there's bathing, there's swimming, there's boating. All those things have been touched on by the earlier cases. But then in 1971, there was this decision in a case called Marks versus Whitney, which wasn't really a turning point itself because the court said some things that weren't really necessary to the decision. The case was a boundary dispute between two landowners on Tomales Bay, and also there was an issue of access to Tomales Bay, but really no broad environmental questions there. But nonetheless, in Marks and Whitney, 1971, the California Supreme Court said that the public trust doctrine is, quote, not burdened by an outmoded classification favoring one mode of utilization over another. And then they went on and they said one of the most important uses of the tidelands, remember this was a tidelands case, not a water rights case, one of the most important uses of the tidelands, a use encompassed within the tidelands trust, is the preservation of those lands in their natural state so that they may serve as ecological units for scientific study, as open space, and as environments which provide food and habitat for birds and marine life, and which favorably affect the scenery and climate of the area. Now, those dicta sat there for a long time after 1971, but they became very important in Audubon, because Audubon wasn't just about bathing or fishing. As the court noted in Audubon, Justice Broussard said, the principal values of interest to the plaintiffs were, quote, recreational and ecological, unquote. They wanted to protect, quote, the scenic views of the lake and its shore, the purity of the air, and the use of the lake for nesting and feeding by birds. So that's a third item that I want to mention now. Mono Lake cases is more than just Audubon in 1983. There were these very important Court of Appeal decisions in 1989 and 1990. I actually prefer the term mono basin cases rather than mono lake cases. But anyway, there were these two cases, the so-called Cal Trout cases, that dealt with two different provisions, two different sections in the California Fish and Game Code, 5937 and 5946. Now, 5937 has a lineage that goes way, way back. There's the Salmon Act in 1854 that had a glaring exception, but nonetheless provided for access in rivers for salmon, really a line of thinking that goes back to Magna Carta. Magna Carta has provisions also on removing weirs from rivers and things like that. The Cal Trout opinions effectively applied the Fish and Game Code provisions, not a turning point in the same way. It wasn't introducing new law. It was taking well-established old law, which had been kind of ignored for a long time, and putting it to use as it should be. There was a in the UC Davis Law Review that published the papers from our conference in 1980, there was a student comment about this, and it's well known that the Department of Fish and Game had simply kind of given up on really trying to take any effective action under 5937. They hadn't gotten good results from the courts. It was kind of what you might think of as dead law on the books, but not being used. So the turning point was not to bring in new law. The turning point was to take what was on the books and make sense of it and apply it. And we had this very intricate, very well-reasoned decision in 1989 that did just that. And luckily, we have Justice Blease here, and he's going to give his viewpoint on those decisions. So I won't say anything more about that. I think I'm going to make it within my time, Michael. Well, I don't even have 6 minutes to talk, but maybe we'll have questions if you want. Let me just state a conclusion. As obviously, I'm a proponent of the public trust doctrine, particularly with regard to the exercise of water rights. My fear is that public trust doctrine will end up the same way as the reasonable beneficial use doctrine in the California Constitution that was put in the Constitution in 1928, and that is very much discussed but very seldom applied. In the cases I've mentioned, there have been real results. Mono Lake, the dropping of the lake level has ended. The lake level has recovered, not greatly, but some. The streams are flowing. It's wonderful. I was up there in September, and the streams have lots of water in them, and the Mono Lake Committee has just negotiated an agreement with Los Angeles Department of Water and Power to do an even better job. I think we'll hear about that later. So real results there, real results on the American River case. So East Bay Mud is taking its water from Freeport and not from further up on the American River. Real results on Puda Creek, where there are fish flows that are adhered to by the interest in Solano. But that's about it, maybe one or two other situations. So I very much look forward to hearing during the day of maybe some other situations where there's one of the great public trust scholars just walking in. Jan, come in. Jan gave one of the lead papers in our conference in 1980 and was an outstanding force in the Attorney General's office speaking out for public trust over many years. Welcome. And we'll see what happens in the future with public trust, whether it becomes a vibrant part of California water law or whether it is more like the reasonable use provision that really, in my opinion, aside from the Imperial Valley situation, the IID situation, there hasn't been a whole lot done with reasonable beneficial use. Okay, I'm out of material. There's a minute left. Do you want to defer questions till later? Or okay, Mark, I think it's yours. I don't see any hands.
Mark Del Piero is now an attorney in private practice in Monterey. Excuse me. Thank you. Mark is now an attorney in private practice in Monterey. He served for more than 7 years as a member of the State Water Resources Control Board, and he was the hearing officer for the board's Mono Lake hearing, leading to decision D-1631. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Everyone can hear? Good. Hap indicated that he was happy to, fluvial geomorphology. That's the term that I make my students say. Some of you know I taught for a while, from 92 until a couple of years ago at Santa Clara University, and that's the term that we make them say at the beginning of the water law class. It's very, very nice to be here today. It's very nice to see some good friends. I got bad news. Some of you got real old. But you're here, which is better than the alternative. I served on the State Water Resources Control Board from 92 until 99. And before I begin, I want to make a couple of comments, and then my friend over there is going to take care of the slides for me while I make the presentation outlining Decision 1631. First of all, show and tell. This is it. I've had this sitting on my shelf for 20 years, and so I brought it because I promised Richard Roos Collins I was going to bring it 20 years later, and here it is. So the discussion that we're going to talk about today could not have happened without certain individuals, and I need to address those issues now, and I will be brief. First person I want to thank is a guy who's not been with us in a long time. His name was Don Maughan. For those of you who don't know who Don Maughan was, he was the chairman of the State Water Resources Control Board for the first 2 years that I was on the board. And Don sadly passed away not long after he left the board. And the last thing Don Maughan did was he appointed me to be the hearing officer for Mono Lake. So I point that out, everybody, because sometimes, there's an old saying in Italian, sounds better in Italian than in English, it's better to be lucky than smart. I don't know that necessarily everybody got lucky with me being appointed to be the hearing officer, but the consequences of what happened and my particular background were, I guess, recognized by Don as having a significant application to the issues that ultimately were going to be addressed. And so that's the first person I want to thank. Everyone else who served admirably before me in my capacity as hearing officer did tremendous work. It's one of those experiences that lawyers read about in case books, but the fact is that the quality of lawyering that took place during the course of the 43-day hearing that I conducted was exemplary on both sides, truly was. Both sides, and I commended them 20 years ago, and I'm saying it again, there are too many people to name, but they were remarkable. One person I want to call out, because I know he's listening, he couldn't be here today, Jim Kennedy, my best friend during my entire tenure on the State Water Resources Control Board, helped me put together the slides for today. Jim couldn't be with us today. Singularly, the person that helped me the most, being a hearing officer when you can't talk to anybody else except your staff, is very difficult. And he was always there and always provided me with great guidance and great help during the course of the process. So we're done with that, and I want to move on to my presentation. So, Luke's got it, right? Good. Okay, so as I indicated before, Jim and I have been working on this for about 4 weeks now. So, Luke, would you move on to the 4th slide, please? There you go. Mono Lake is a work in progress. I wish I could tell you I was brilliant enough to say that. I wasn't. A gentleman named Eldon Vestal said that, and we'll talk about Eldon a little bit later on. Eldon was the fish and game official on the east side of the Sierras during the 40s and the 30s and the 40s, and who remarkably kept daily notes, weekly notes, monthly notes of the decline and diminishment of the environmental resources of the Mono Basin during that entire period of time, and he kept them in a remarkable place. He kept them in a trunk in his garage. And ultimately, when we did the hearings back in 1992, they came out of his garage. And it was remarkable for me and for those of us that worked on the decision to be able to understand substantively what the condition of the environmental resources were in 1940, 1939, 1940, 1941, before the diversion started. Because that was the baseline that we looked to in terms of the development of Decision 1631 and where we hoped to be able to move Mono back to. The State Water Resources Control Board's mission is, as it says on there, to preserve, enhance, and restore the quality of California's water resources and to ensure their proper allocation and efficient use for the benefit of present and future generations. And we were cognizant at the time of our charge within the context of that legislative responsibility to ensure that the development of 1631 addressed not only our responsibility, but our sense of history, if you will, within the context of recognizing that we had pretty much a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to restore an ecosystem that was rare, that was unique, and that had captured the minds and the emotions of many, many people throughout the state of California. Next. The next one is a cartoon because after a while, all of us get a little boring when we start talking. The fact is, California, everybody knows here, is a desert. Everyone knew it, including the mission founders who came through at the earliest part of the state. But that's neither here nor there. It's a reflection of the movement of water around the state of California that has made this one of the greatest economies in the nation. What's the context in terms of Mono Lake? Mono Lake has been, since the 40s, a primary source of water that drove an economic engine in the Southland, in Los Angeles, that is virtually unique and incomparable within the world. And so we have to understand that in terms of the decision-making process made by the state board, it was important to effectively address the balancing requirements of the National Audubon decision that had been handed down in 1983, recognizing that the potential loss of water, absent some alternative replacement supply, could in fact have directly and significantly adversely affected the economic well-being of Los Angeles. We took that charge very seriously. The wonderful thing about the State Water Resources Control Board is that it had the capacity, particularly with the remarkable assistance of the Mono Lake Committee and a tremendous amount of political negotiations and lobbying by a huge number of folks. We had the opportunity to create, through water conservation, wastewater reclamation, and a variety of strategies and scenarios, a replacement supply that was actually, and ultimately became, larger than the water that was taken in order to restore the ecosystems in Mono Lake. Mono Lake sits on the edge of the Great Basin. It's a remnant salt salt lake that is over 700,000 years old. It has two primary species in it, brine fly and brine shrimp. We'll talk about those in a while. Next. It's the remnant of Lake Lahontan that existed in prehistoric times. Mono Lake, as it exists now, is actually a remnant of another lake called Lake Russell. And what we have now is a lake that has 5 tributary streams: Mill Creek, Lee Vining, Walker, Parker, and Rush Creek, where the reservoir and the primary diversion point for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power has been for a number of years. Next. This gives you a brief indication for those of you from Southern California. It didn't always look like that. For those of you from Northern California, I think you think it always did look like that. But the population in LA is now pushing 4 million, and it's not easy, particularly when we're facing a statewide drought of not perhaps biblical proportions, but certainly the third worst in my lifetime, that it is important to understand that every drop of water is important, whether it's fresh water or reclaimed or desalinated. It's important, and it's also important to understand that our population, unless something changes radically, is not going to diminish. It's going to continue to grow it, so we need to effectively deal with that growing population that went from 1,600 folks in 1850 to 160 years later at almost 4 million folks. Next. Blame him. Blame that man. Okay? For those of you that don't know who that is, that's William Mulholland. William Mulholland was the visionary who ultimately conceived of the LA Aqueduct. He recognized in the beginning of the last century that absent a supplemental supply of water for the city of Los Angeles, there was no way they were going to realize their manifest destiny, whatever that was. And so, because he had not only the confidence, but the purse strings, because they were given to him by the city council in LA, he went about running the municipal water department that was the predecessor to the LADWP, in such a way that he pursued the development of a comprehensive water supply system that first exploited the water resources of the eastern Sierras in the Owens Basin, and then subsequently ran the pipeline up farther north into Mono County to exploit 4 out of the 5 tributary streams to Mono Lake. Next. This is his dream. One more. Sorry about that. Nope, no, you went too far. There. This is his dream. And those of you that have driven back and forth from the east side will probably recognize that. It was realized in 1913 when water started flowing into Los Angeles. Famous quote, "There it is, take it," he was not a particularly articulate fellow, but but that's the quote that everyone attributes to him. If I wanted to be remembered, I would have come up with something a little catchier, but be that as it may, that set the tone and the stage for huge urbanization in Southern California that goes on to this day. In 1940, as Hap indicated, the city of Los Angeles came to the state of California and requested permits to divert streams in the Mono Basin. And at that time, those permits were granted. One more. That's good. The annual runoff there in the basin is about 187,000 a year. Between 41 and 1970, the out-of-basin diversions were approximately 57,000. Keep in mind there's a whole lot of water lost by evaporation that takes place over there, as well as a variety of other sources. The long and the short of it is the second barrel of the diversion in the aqueduct was completed in 1970, and that's when everything sort of went to hell. That's for those of you who aren't lawyers, that's a legal term. Okay. Next one. There we go. You can see 62, and by 1995, it didn't look so good. I would point out, however, that during the course of the discussions about the hearings on D1631, one of the things that the California Department of Parks was particularly concerned about is if we raise the lake level so high, the tufa would disappear. And so the scenic aspects of the might be less scenic, because if you take a I mean, the tufa are sort of a two-edged sword. It demonstrates the ecological devastation that's resulted from the diversion of the water, yet they also happen to be the most scenic thing that everyone takes a picture of when they go to the Mono Basin. And so I would point that out because from historic levels, it was actually a 45-foot drop in the vertical elevation of the lake. And we're in the process of recovering now. Current lake level is at 63.